All right, guys, so we're going to continue with lesson 3.2. We're going to look at some proofs today. All right, so let me present my screen. All right. So this is our first attempt at doing some of these parallel line proofs. I'll walk you through some. All right, for these proofs, you're going to be given a piece of information. It says mark your diagram. That's super important. Mark your diagram with whatever information is given. And then you're going to be asked to prove that a pair of angles are either congruent or supplementary. All right, so I'll walk you through some of these proofs. Okay, so for the first one, oops, I need to go up a little bit. I can't see. There we go. So for the first one, let me get started by setting up my T-chart. If I can find my pen, there we go. So I have my statements and I have my reasons. And the first statement is the given, so we'll start with that. You're given that K is parallel to M, or L, sorry, K and L, not M. And is it transversal? Let's try that again. K is parallel to L, that's given. All right, so we were told to mark the given. To mark parallel lines, we just use our arrows. Okay, we're asked to prove that angle 2, I'm just going to mark it with yellow for now. We want to prove that angle 2 and angle 7 are congruent. Now, one thing to keep in mind, you cannot have a two-step proof. If you have a two-step proof, that means that you're trying to prove whatever justification you're trying to use in your proof, okay? So just keep in mind, you can never have a two-step proof. If you do, you have to find a different way to prove what you're being asked to prove. Now, my suggestion with these proofs, if you're asked to prove that angle 2 is congruent to angle 7, start with one of the angles or the other, doesn't matter which one, start with angle 2. Look at the diagram, tell me about angle 2 in relation to any other angle there. I don't care which angle, you can say angle 2 is congruent to 4 because they're corresponding angles. You could say that angle 2 is congruent to 5 because they're vertical angles. Right? So give me some kind of relationship between angle 2 and another angle there. All right, let's say angle 2 and angle 4. Now, all of our proofs could be different, and that's okay. Just make sure whatever you're writing is accurate. So you're going to say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Right, angle 2 and angle 4. And your justification, it's because parallel lines, where did my arrow go here? I erased it. Because parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent. So that's what you write. Parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent. Now we've pulled angle 2 into the proof. We somehow need to pull angle 7 into the proof. So is 7 related to any of the angles that you already spoke about? What do you know about 7 and 4? 7 and 4 are congruent because they're vertical angles. So let's state that. So now you can say angle 4 is congruent to angle 7, and your justification, vertical angles congruent. Now, if you can, see if the puzzle pieces fit together to give you something new. If they don't, that's okay, but let's see if they do fit together. All right. If angle 2 is congruent to angle 4 and angle 4 is congruent to angle 7, what can you conclude? You can say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 7. Why? You could either use substitution or transitive here. Or transitive. Either justification is fine. All right. Let's look at number 2. All right, we're going to set up statements and reasons. get started with the given that K is parallel to L. We'll mark that on our diagram with our arrows. K is parallel to L. We're asked to prove that 1 is supplementary to 7. So like I did in the last proof, I would start with 1 or 7, up to you, and tell me something that you know and that you can justify. So for instance, angle 1 is, you could say that it is congruent to angle 3. You would say angle 1 is congruent to angle 8. You would say angle 1 is congruent to angle 6. Lots of different options. You just have to justify it. So let's say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Let's go there. So I'm going to say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And the justification, what kind of angles are they? We're going to say parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent. Now we pulled angle 3 into the proof. How can you pull angle 7 into the proof and relate it to maybe angle 3? Because that's the one we just talked about, we spoke about. You'd say angle 3 and angle 7 are supplementary because they're a linear pair, right? They're adjacent and they form a line. So we could say that angle 3 is sup to angle 7, and the justification there is linear pair. All right, from there, how do those two connect to give us something new? Well, since 1 and 3 are congruent, let's replace this 3 with what it's equal to. Replace it with an angle 1. So I'm going to say angle 1 is sup to angle 7, and that is substitution. In this case, it cannot be transitive. It has to be substitution. Okay, let's try another one. All right. Let me skip 3 because it's similar to the one we just did. I'm going to go to 4 because it looks a little bit different. All right, so I have my statements and my reasons. I have 2 pieces of given this time. I have that ST is parallel to PR. So I'm going to mark that. ST is parallel to PR. That's given. And I'm also given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Okay, so that's all my given information. All right, so we want to prove that angle P is congruent to angle R. So let's get started. We again have to introduce angle P or angle R into the proof. Let's start with angle P. Angle P and angle 1, and this diagram is kind of harder to see, and if you want to, it might be helpful. This is what I often do. Ooh, come on. I extend the lines. It just is easier for my brain to kind of see what's going on because I'm used to seeing the lines extended like this. So, and I can even extend the transversal, right? Ooh, try to do a straight line there. And this transversal as well. All right, so angle 1 and angle P are corresponding angles. So I can say that angle 1 is congruent to angle P, and the justification there is parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent. All right. Now see if the pieces of the puzzle fit together to give you a new statement. If angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 and angle 1 is congruent to angle P, what do you know? You know that 2 is congruent to P. Angle 2 is congruent to angle P. And your justification is transitive. You could use substitution here as well. All right, so look at what you're trying to prove. You're trying to say that P is congruent to R. You have P is congruent to 2. So let's look back at the diagram and think, what do we know about angle 2 in relation to angle R? Angle 2 and angle R are also corresponding angles. So you can say that angle 2 is congruent to angle R because parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent. And then finally, try to fit these pieces of the puzzle together to get your last statement. So if angle 2 is congruent to angle P and angle 2 is also congruent to angle R, you can replace this 2 with what it's equal to, which is R. So then you have angle R is congruent to angle P, and that was by transitive again, or substitution. Okay. Let's keep on moving along. I'm going to show you, I think, just 2 more. Let's see, I'll do number 7. Yeah, I'll do 7, and then I'll do 8. I said 7, I meant 6. 6 and then 8. So go up just a bit so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so let's set it up. Statements. And reasons. All right, so the given is that A is parallel to B, and that also C is parallel to D. Now, one thing you might want to try doing is breaking the given up. And what I mean by that is maybe we just start with A is parallel to B and we hold off on C is parallel to D. Okay, so I'm going to erase that and maybe come back to it later. Now, if you're not comfortable enough to do this yet, you can just write them at the same time. But I just kind of want to look at one piece of information at a time. So if A is parallel to B, what does that allow us to say? Well, we have 2 different transversals, right? If you kind of cover this transversal up, all right, and maybe I'll just kind of scribble over it. It makes it a little bit easier to focus if you just look at one line at a time. If A is parallel to B and I look at C as my transversal, I could say things like 5 is congruent to 10, alternate interior angles. 6 is congruent to 9, alternate interior angles. 1 is congruent to 14. 2 is congruent to 13, right? 5 is congruent to 13. Lots of different relationships. Then I would have to cover up C as my transversal. And I have a bunch of other relationships over here. I could say 3 is congruent to 16, 11 is congruent to 8, 4 is congruent to 12, 3 is congruent to 8, and I can justify all those statements, okay? So there's lots of statements I could say, but we want to obviously only use the statements that we need. So let's look at what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove that 1 is congruent to 16. So maybe start with angle 1 and tell me about angle 1 and another angle on the diagram. Okay, you could say like angle 1 is congruent to angle 9. Let's start there. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 9. And why do you know that? They're corresponding angles. So let's start with that. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 9. And that's because parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent. All right, Now let's use the other piece of given information and see if we can pull something else in. We're told that C is parallel to D, and that is given. Again, you don't have to break this given information up if you don't want. So I'm going to use my yellow. Oh, let me mark. I said that 1 is congruent to 9. I didn't put the arc on there yet. All right, so now I'm looking at this line being parallel to that line. And just like I did for the other example, I'd have to scribble out this transversal and look at these angles. What's the relationship between these angles? Then I'd scribble out this transversal and look at these angles and talk about the relationship between them. All right, so being that I want to pull 16 into the proof, I'm going to focus on this transversal. What is the relationship between angle 16 and another angle in the diagram? Well, you could say like 16 and 14 are corresponding angles, right? Let's do that one. So 16, I'm going to give 2 arcs, and 14 as well gets 2 arcs. They are congruent because they're corresponding angles. So I can say angle 16 is congruent to angle 14 because parallel lines implies corresponding angles congruent, right? Okay, so I can't connect them yet because 1, 9, 16, and 14 have nothing in common, but let's go back to the diagram and see if there's anything else now that I can figure out. I'm trying to go back to red. What's the relationship between 9 and 14? They're congruent because they're vertical angles. So let's write that down. I can say that angle 9 is congruent to angle 14 because vertical angles are congruent. All right. Hide this thing. And then where do I go from there? Well, let's see how I can connect all 3 of these pieces of information, right, to come up with something new. If 1 is congruent to 9 and 9 is congruent to 14, what does that mean about 1 and 14? It means 1 is congruent to 14, right? So we could write that down. 1 is congruent to 14. And then if 16 is congruent to 14 and 1 is congruent to 14, what does that mean? It means that 16 is congruent to 1. And we use transitive twice. I've run out of room. I'm just going to write it. Transitive. You actually don't even need to write 2 steps. You could list both of those under step 6, and then the justification would be transitive step 6. Okay. All right, good. Lots. That was a longer proof. Okay, they're normally not that long, but they can be. All right, let's do the last one for today. Number 8, and I wanted to do this one because there's a way to do it and make it just a 3-step proof, but it requires a theorem that we talked about earlier in chapter 2 that we don't use all that often, but if you remember it, it makes some proofs much more easy. Statements, reasons, much more simple. All right. So I have 2 pieces of given. I'm going to write them both down. I know that AB is parallel to CD, and I know that AD is parallel to BC. That's all given. All right. Now I can mark it. AB, this one here, is parallel to CD. And then AD, so the way we mark the second pair of parallel lines is putting 2 arrows, is parallel to BC. Try to get them on the line. All right, so we're trying to prove that 1 is congruent to 3. Let's start with 1, or let's start with 3 and talk about them. What do we know? Let's start with 1. Angle 1 is what in relation to angle 2? parallel lines cut by a transversal. And again, if you need to extend, because sometimes our brains need to see the lines extended. Why is this not wanting to change colors? Go black. There we go. Sometimes we need to see those lines extended. Parallel lines cut by a transversal. Ignore the other transversal for the moment. What's the relationship between 1 and 2? They are same side interior angles, which means they are supplementary. So you could say that angle 1 is supplementary to angle 2. And the reason is parallel lines implies same side interior angles sup. All right, well now your eyes have to adjust. Let's look at parallel, oops, nope, sorry. These are the parallel lines now that we need to focus on. Let me extend. Now we're gonna focus on these parallel lines cut by this transversal here. So you kind of have to adjust. What's the relationship between 2 and 3? Same thing, they're same side interior angles, so they're supplementary. So I can say that angle 3 is sup to angle 2. And it's the same justification, so I can list it under the same step. Now, do you guys remember, if 2 angles are supplementary to the same angle, what do you know about those 2 angles? You can even just make up numbers to help you. Let's say that this is 100 degrees. That would make this one 80. Right? 180 because they're supplementary. 100 degrees, this one's 80. Well, if angle 2 is 80, angle 2 is still 80 here. So what's angle 3 have to be? 100 degrees. What does that mean about 1 and 3? They're congruent. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Now the justification. It's called the congruent sup theorem. That's what it's called. The congruent sup theorem. The congruent supplementary angle theorem. Which says, you might have too many humps there, sorry, THM period, which says that if 2 angles, 1 and 3, are supplementary to the same angle, they're both supplementary to angle 2, then those 2 angles are congruent. It's the congruent sup theorem, all right? All right, let me delete this and come say goodbye. So guys, that is it for lesson 3. What was that, 2? And I'll see you back here for the next lesson. Bye.